I would like to then now move our conversation over and invite Brad Hirsch, who's the head of product and implementation at Verily Alphabet, to come to the podium. Brad, thank you.
I appreciate the opportunity to talk today. So my only disclosure is my employment at Verily, as well as I sit on the board of a bioelectronics company that's a JV between Verily and GSK. For folks that don't know, and I won't belabor this for the sake of time, Verily started as Google Life Sciences back in 2013, spun out to an independent part of the Alphabet structure, one of our bets, and today it's about 1,500 employees with offices around the world, and we've raised about $3.5 billion at capital. And the money is important because of the scope of what we tried to achieve, as well as what I think some of the key learnings are. So I'm going to give a couple of examples that are not specific to oncology first, around how we've thought of taking precision diagnostics and how to actually get them to scale. I think one of the things that we're talking about, part of the point of my talk today, but I think one of the struggles that we all feel is we can do great science. We have a new member of our product team who's one of the preeminent AI folks in the world, came from Google Health, wrote some of the seminal papers in lung cancer screening and other areas, diabetic retinopathy tools with AI. But the question is, how do you get her brilliant findings and the work that she's done for so long now into actual utilization at scale? And I'll give you two examples outside of oncology, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we're focused on. First is screening for diabetic retinopathy. So again, this is one of Lily's papers, but looking at real-time diabetic retinopathy screening as a mechanism to look around the world. And the reality was fantastic science, really exciting work, but to really get it to scale, we had to build our own camera. And the beauty of the camera is its ability in 98.5% of patients to be able to autonomously identify the retina, take a picture, send it to the cloud, and allow the AI to be applied in the cloud. And so to be able to develop this device was a feat of engineering. It was understanding the regulatory pathways. It was understanding the reimbursement pathways. And the first camera is now in place in Baton Rouge, and the hope is that we're gonna actually start to get scale. And part of the reason we invested in it is the belief that it can also be used for CKD screening and CAD screening, and it's one of the few real views into the human body is through the retina without something more invasive. And so it's a great example where this is decades worth of work, seems pretty straightforward and simple, but took a ton of sophistication and a truly cross-functional team to understand the regulatory implications, the reimbursement implications, the clinical implications, et cetera. Another one is we have our own study watch. And I think every 3 months somebody joins and says, why would you possibly develop your own watch, right? There are all these consumer wearables. There's a ton out there. Why would you do this? And it always ends in the same place, which is if you look at the consumer wearables, you don't have access to primary data. Generally on the device itself, it's actually running the algorithms so that they can actually do what they need to do and maintain battery life, et cetera. So you don't even have the raw data often on the devices. In addition to that, they're changing the sensors, they're changing their algorithms, and you don't own the UX, so you can't actually drive the experience of the individual with that watch. So again, incredible investment on the Verily side to get to the point we're just about to launch our third version of the watch. But you can see on the bottom right, we had a Nature Digital Medicine paper last year in 2022 in Parkinson's, because not only do we have all the elements of the watch, but we can actually run them through a virtual motor exam on the wrist. So 6 different things. It tells you what to do next. It counts you down, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You do it for 20 seconds. It then asks you your experience. It gives you a PRO, and it moves on to the next. And because of sort of the holistic ownership of the device, we're actually able to build some really interesting precision diagnostics through that process. So I don't want to belabor the point, but the big thing for us has been, how do we actually, I'm going to skip the colonoscopy example, but how do we actually develop the evidence generation infrastructure to drive these things at scale? For folks that have ever seen a talk by my boss, Amy Abernathy, you've seen this slide. She gives it in many of her talks. But it's this idea that we're seeing phase 1 through phase 3, clinical development moving further and further, or approval moving earlier and earlier. And we have a void of evidence development. And it's a void that everybody who's trying to develop precision diagnostics, like we're talking about today, experiences every day. There's what can we do in the health system, there's what can we get out of the HR, but I would argue it's much broader. And so our big push right now is Verily, and its relevance to the conversation today, is to say yes, there's an ecosystem for clinical trials that's existed for a long time. There's an ecosystem for clinical care. And interestingly, there were some big changes at Verily earlier this year that brought together research and care groups under one leadership. And so now I helped oversee all of the products we developed as well as how we implement them, which was an important change. Because if you're not actually on the implementation side, then you're not going to build the products that can actually be used in practice, right? And within care, we have a virtual diabetes company. We will soon have a footprint in oncology, et cetera. And so we're saying, first, you have to bring these things to care so that it is not just a research, we're not just standing up a study, or we're not just delivering virtual diabetes care, but they're one and the same. We need to bring those two data sets together. And then another big push is how do you bring all the data that exists in the ecosystem that might not be readily available in an EHR or in a point of care together as well to really bring a holistic picture to the stage. We think there are really 5 key elements to doing this. I don't think this is specific to Verily at all, but this is really where we're focused. First is around precision recruitment, and I'll walk you through these briefly. So here, you can imagine with Verily roots, with Alphabet roots, we have a pretty sophisticated group of how do you look at social media and search and other elements to identify individuals and recruit them into whether it's care or projects or clinical trials. And so we have a huge push. It doesn't matter if it's an eligibility file that a payer is giving us, or L'Oreal. I was talking to Neil a second ago that we just kicked off a project with L'Oreal. As an oncologist, I never thought I'd be running a precision beauty study at scale, but it's actually incredibly exciting, the science that they want to put forward. But there, how do you get 20,000 women, 20 to 40-year-olds in the South with hyperpigmentation in their face that are either Hispanic or Black, right? We can actually target at that kind of granularity to pull folks in. It's a huge distinction. The second thing that we are very, very focused on is consent and permission. So we are going after everybody that is going to that participates to get them to consent and truly understand what we're doing with them. The belief is this is a core differentiation for anybody that's doing projects today. And not only do they consent, but there's a permission model on the back end that says, what exactly did you consent to do and for how long? And can we go back and ask you about that again, right? So this idea, and that should actually drive the data infrastructure on the other side of it. So it's not only you're getting the consent and understanding, but that actually automates what we can do with those individuals, what we can recruit them to, what data we can aggregate, et cetera. The next one that we're really focused on is this idea of putting the patient's voice at the center. And this is in a tactical, tangible way, meaning for the people that we consent and get permission, we send them regular PROs. We have a 75-person user experience team whose job is to figure out how do you motivate people to want to fill these elements out, whether it's a KCCQ and heart failure or a PHQ-9 or all sorts of different elements. How do we truly get longitudinal information from the individual and use the consent process and the permission process to get them excited to take part in that? The fourth is passive tools. I showed you the watch. We're kicking off a project right now on the performance status side. If I had more time, I could walk you through some of how we're thinking about ECOG and Karnofsky, and obviously it's a relatively low bar to replicate those elements in practice, but it still takes a pretty significant project to kick it off and validate it and show. So in Parkinson's, we did a lot of work to show comparisons between office-based assessments of the virtual motor exam at home and what does that mean. So a big push into different passive and novel tools, whether that's a retinal scanner or a watch or other things we're developing. And then the fifth is this idea of bringing the data sets together. So here, and again, I think what we've seen over the years is there are a lot of solutions, whether Neil's talking next with fantastic work at Flatiron around how do you look at EHR data, but there are companies that do medical record review at scale and have actually put people behind many of the hospital firewalls to be able to get those medical records, right? There are groups that have done fantastic work in sensors. So there are all these different groups, and it's a really unique moment that 10 years ago, when I left academics, didn't exist. I would say in the last 10 years, there have been all these different elements that have been developed, and we're at a really important moment in time where if you have the consent in the individual, you have them alongside for the journey, and you go out and you start looking and you understand the ecosystem, there's actually an incredible amount that you can do and surface back to them and get the review of. And so that's really a core sort of foundational thesis for us. For us, it very much is, we have a lot of health system partners. Prior to this, worked with a lot of health systems on research infrastructure on something called a site CTMS that I had founded a company around. And there, again, we're not trying to say we're cutting you out of the process. They're actually coming along on these projects and actually, hopefully, consenting many of their patients to the infrastructure we're building and looking at shared models, both from an ownership perspective of the data and the output and sort of the academic successes, as well as from the finances. And so really trying to build this at scale. And then to tie it back to some of the AI ML work, just in the last couple of seconds here, this infrastructure becomes incredibly important for things like real-world performance of AI models, right? This idea that as we are putting these things into the world, whether it's a retinopathy screener or we're using our watch to look at ECOG and other elements, we can then monitor this over time because we're deploying it within the ecosystem we've built and not having to build one-offs to do this work. We can collect a lot of the data routine care, and we're pushing hard to actually continue to grow our infrastructure as that routine care and be really proactive and share that information. And so that's the big push that we're going through right now. So thank you for the opportunity to present.